Okay, so I'll start. So today we are going to talk about the CSS. Now, what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So I'll open a new file. Okay. So let's talk about CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. Okay, so what do you mean by cascading style sheet? Means if you put a style in one sheet, it will be cascaded to other pages as well. Means you have to write the CSS once and it will be applied to all the HTML available in your project, right? CSS describes how HTML elements are to be displayed on screen, right? So basically you put the styling and decide how your HTML elements are going to be displayed. We can control basically if we know how to decide the HTML elements display. It basically means we can control the layout of web pages. So we can control the right. So as I told you, there are types of CSS. So one is your internal CSS. Second one is your external CSS. So internal CSS, that is the CSS which is present in the same file as HTML. So this is applicable to only that particular page, right? So if this is my HTML page, right? If I write down my CSS over here, it would be applicable to this particular page. Right? Okay. Second is external CSS. So external CSS is the CSS which are stored in separate CSS file. Right. So we are going to talk about both the types of CSS, internal CSS and the external CSS. Now, internal CSS is again divided into two parts, right? One is your inline CSS. Inline CSS means if I make the CSS applicable to this particular line element, I'm writing down my CSS, that is inline CSS. Second one is using a style tag. Right. So CSS can be applied in majorly two ways, internal CSS and external CSS. If we talk about internal CSS, we can apply it using inline CSS, means we can write the CSS with the HTML element, or we can use the style tag. Anyone, any questions, any doubts till now?
No, sir. You can go ahead.
Okay. So let's see an example, right? Okay. So this is my body, right? And over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just use some HTML elements. So H1, this is CSS, right? And then This can be one of my paragraph. Right. So this is my current HTML page. Let me run this page. So you can see it is simple CSS now. I will beautify it. We'll add some BR tags, or let me just simply use unordered list over here. So I'm trying to maximize the use of HTML elements, which we have learned till now. And let us put it into the li. Right. And then this could be my right. And this could be my. Does it make sense to you guys what I'm trying to do? I'm just trying to use different HTML elements which we have learned till now. And here I will simply use ordered list. Here I will simply go for BR. Right. Now I want to put the CSS to this particular page. So for that, we have, first of all, we will see how to use the C style tag, right? In order to use the style tag, what we can do is we can use style tag inside your head component. And here I will put one style element. Okay. So this is how you, inside this particular element, you can write down the CSS, and whatever CSS you are writing down inside this particular tag, it will be applicable to all of this page. Right? Does it make sense? Anyone? Any questions?
No question, sir.
Okay. So what I have done, I've just created a style tag, and inside this style tag, I'm going to write down my CSS. Now, let's say I want to apply my CSS to this whole body. We will talk first of all only about HTML elements, right? So using HTML tags, how to apply the CSS on complete tag itself, right? So for example, I want to write down the CSS to this particular body, right? So for that, what we are going to do is we are going to type body, because we want to apply the CSS to this particular body, and open and close curly braces. So inside this body, inside this curly braces, whatever CSS we are going to write would be applicable to this particular body. Make sense?
Can you repeat that, sir? Sorry.
Let's say I want to apply a CSS to this body. Okay, so body is the HTML element which we want to make or styled, right? So what I have done, I've just copied the body element and open and close curly braces. So CSS always goes inside this open and close curly braces if you talk about inline CSS.
So that style will be applied on body.
On the whole of body, whatever is inside this body tag.
Okay.
Okay. Now let's say what CSS I want to apply. Let's say I want to apply a background color. So background color would be applied. So background, and then we want to apply a color, right? So we will simply say, so this is one property that I want to change the background color of my body, and background color, let's say I want to change it to light blue. So let's see how it looks like, right? So you can see now my complete body means the whole page is looking right. Anyone, any questions, any doubt?
No, sir. You can go ahead.
Right. So what we have done, we have applied the CSS to this whole body. Now let's say I want to apply a CSS to this H1, right? So what we can do is, anyone, any suggestions? What we are going to do?
We write just a head, H1.
H1.
Yeah, and curly bracket.
Right. Now let's say I want to change the color of color to white, right? So there are many attributes, many attributes. I'll try to cover as many attributes as possible, but there are n number of attributes which are available in CSS, right? So let's say color. Now if you say, when I say color, it changed the font color of that particular thing, right? Now it CSS become white, right? Now if I want to align in the center, so how to align in center? Anyone? We have covered this in HTML. How to align the content in center? You're not audible, Talash.
Simply say center.
Simply say center. But let's see how to do it with CSS. So with CSS, we will simply say text align center. Now you can see your CSS is aligned in the center. Right? Any questions? Any doubt? Anyone? Any questions? Any doubt? So basically we have covered three properties. One is background color, one is color, what is text align, right? Now let's see few more. Let's say I want to change the size of my paragraph, right? So paragraph is the HTML tag we are going to change, right? And let's say I want to change the font size. So font size. So if you see, CSS attributes always use Pascal naming convention. It is Pascal naming convention, or you can say snake naming convention. It looks like snakes basically. Okay, so font size, let's say font size could be 20. Now there is a measuring unit in CSS, like we have centimeters, millimeters, right? Similarly in CSS, there is a measuring unit called as pixels, represented by px, right? So everything should be given in the measuring unit. Like we want to make the font size of 20 pixels. Just so we'll see in some other, like we want to change the font size in li. I will explain it in later classes why it doesn't change in the when we are saying p over here, why it is not changing. We will cover it in next classes. 20 pixels. So what I have done is I have changed the font size in li directly, means the list tag of my ul and ol, and I'm making my font size as 20 pixels, right? So you can see 20 pixels is applied to all the list element except this, because this is not part of li tag. This is not part of li tag any, right? That's the reason these are not changed, but everything else is changed. And you can see the font is also changed, right? Make sense? So this font family is nothing but the font family which we see on Word, right? So if we open any Word document, we can always choose the font. Is it Calibri? Is it Verdana? Is it some other font, right? So that is called as font family in CSS, and we can choose our font family in which font we want to display the text, right? So what we have covered till now, we have seen how to put the CSS inside the same web page. For doing so, we have to just create the style tag, and then we have seen how to apply a CSS to complete HTML element. So by applying a CSS to complete HTML element, we have to use the name of the element and then use the curly braces and write down the CSS inside that particular element, right? So quickly, everyone, create a small example and apply some CSS. Let's say a background color to your body.
Go ahead, Mustafa, share your screen.
Okay. Screen. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen. Okay, perfect. Can you show me the code?
This is the code.
So what you have done, you have just put the
Dark orange
and
and then
perfect. Can you go back?
to the coding.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so you can stop sharing.
Okay.
So basically, what I'm trying to say, how my CSS syntax looks like. So let's talk about CSS syntax. Okay, so I'll simply say my CSS syntax, right? So my CSS syntax here, first of all, I'm using a selector, which is your H1 body or anything. So this particular thing is called a selector, right? Now, after this selector, what I'm doing, I'm using your curly braces, open your curly braces, and then in closing curly braces. And inside that curly braces, I'm using a property and we are using the value. So the property could be color and the value could be white, right? So we have used a selector, then we have used the property, CSS property, and then we have used the value of that property, right? This is how we are representing CSS. If we are putting more than one CSS, we are just putting down the semicolon, then we are again writing one property, let's say text align. So we are basically writing down one property and then we are writing down a value, right? So this is your CSS syntax looks like, simple and clean. Any questions, any doubt?
Sir, you can explain it again, property and value, what's that?
Property and value is, this is called as property and this is called as value. So this is property, this is value, this is property, this is value, this is property, this is value. Property is basically what you are trying to change and what is the value of that particular property.
Okay, so by syntax you mean structure, right?
Yes, how your CSS looks like, how to write down the CSS.
Okay. No, sorry, you can go ahead.
Okay, so basically now we are going to talk about different other selectors. So we have seen an HTML element selector, right? Similarly, there are two more selectors, right? Let's consider this. Let me just create another example for you guys. So we'll create a new file. We'll call it as selector.html, and this is a plain HTML. Let's say I have multiple paragraph element, right? This is paragraph 1. Right, and I will go over here and run the basic. So this is my paragraph 1 right now. Now I want to apply the CSS which we have learned. So similar CSS red, right? It makes sense, nothing new, right? What if I want to apply CSS to this particular line of code using the inline CSS, using the CSS in the style tag, right? So for that, there are two different selectors which came into the picture. One is called as ID selector, another one is called as CS class selector. So one is called as ID selector, right? Another one is your class selector, right? So this is your HTML element selector. Now there are two different, one is ID, another one is class. Now every HTML element in the page can be represented by a unique ID. Okay, so let's talk about ID selector first. Now every element in HTML could be represented by a unique ID. And how to define an ID? So you can define an ID by simply calling an ID attribute, right? So once you give an ID, you can say ID1, right? Now, whenever I talk about ID1, it means I'm talking about this particular line of code, right? Nothing changes if you're concerned about this look and feel. It is just to uniquely identify the element which we have written inside our HTML file, right? So if I want to identify this particular line of code, I will simply refer it as ID1. Make sense?
Sir, is it standard or can we change the ID1 to just one, no ID? I mean,
You can change it to anything,
okay, yeah,
some random thing,
okay.
right? You can say P1, right? So I'll simply go by ID1 as of now, right? So ID1 is this one paragraph. Now I can use this ID selector in order to define my CSS. For example, for this particular ID1, I don't want my color to be red. I want it to be blue, right? So what I can do is I will simply say ID1. And if I'm using an ID selector, I have to precede it by use a prefix or called as hash, right? So hash ID1 and the same curly braces, right? So what it will do is it will, let's change the color, right? So if you see what really happened, we identified the element by using a ID and then use that ID selector. So it is ID selector comprises of two parts. One is hash, another one is name of the ID, and then the simple CSS. Now you can see I'm able to apply a CSS to only one line of code in all the paragraphs. Everything is paragraph, but I am changing the only one line to blue using ID selector.
Sir, I got a question. We studied in HTML, there is a tag span, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, so span and this ID, both are doing the same thing or it's different?
Span is a HTML element. ID is an attribute of an element. Span is this. So it's an HTML element, right? And attribute is something which you define inside the element, right? So ID is an attribute, span is an element.
Okay, so maybe in projects, then the usage will be different.
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
ID1 is just used to uniquely identify any HTML element. Let's say there are many paragraphs, but you want to identify only one paragraph. You can say use ID. Right. So what now you have done? You have defined an ID2 and you can give ID2 a different CSS. Let's say color, and color could be
Like we can change the style in italic, right? Sometimes if we read a book or a paragraph,
we will come to
one part.
stylings. Yes, we can do that.
Okay.
Right. So now you can see I've changed the color of ID2. Let's cover the concepts of HTML because there is no end to the what do you call properties in HTML in CSS. So I'm trying to cover first of all the concepts of CSS, and then we can cover as many properties. Right. Let's learn the concepts first.
Okay, sir. Sorry for interruption.
No, that's okay. It's a good question. Okay, so what we are doing, we have created multiple IDs, and IDs we are using as a selector. How to use the selector? Selector is defined by hash and the name of the ID. Right. So IDs are basically used to uniquely identify the element. So you can give a unique ID to each and every element, and no ID can be repeated. So if I say ID is equal to ID1 and again I say ID equal to ID1, this is wrong. This is working, but this is wrong. The reason is that IDs are always unique, right? So for now it is working because it's simple plain CSS and HTML. But let's say your code gets really complicated and you are using a lot of JavaScript and all, right? Or if you're working in an Angular project, this will give you an error. This will not behave normally. So IDs are always unique inside a page, right? Make sense? So you cannot define the same ID to multiple HTML elements. So if you have used ID1 already, you can say ID2. You cannot use the same ID. Does it make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yes or no? Okay. So now we know ID selector is used in order to give the CSS to a particular identified element. But let's say I have a use case where I want to change the CSS of this paragraph and this paragraph, right? ID1 and ID2 paragraph. Okay, let's leave these two paragraphs. I want to change the CSS. I want to apply the same CSS to these two paragraphs, right? So if it was one paragraph, I would simply go for an ID selector. But let's say if there are multiple paragraphs, we can go by the P selector, but P selector we cannot use because there are other P's as well, right? There are 3 other P's. So we have to find a way where we can apply the CSS to multiple HTML selectors, but not all, right? So for that case, they introduce a class selector, right? So class selector is not unique. It can be repeated. So class, let's say I want to simply say class 1, right? And how to use a class selector? Class selector are used by dot and then the name of the class. Everything remains same. Color. Right. So now you can see it is changed to the green color. Now I can give the same class to different HTML elements. right? So in order to conclude, there is one HTML selector, HTML element selector, which is all the P. If you are using P, it means all the P's will have the same CSS, right? Then you have an ID selector. ID selector, the benefit of ID selector is it is unique across your HTML page. Then we have a class selector. Class selector is used if you want to apply the same CSS to multiple HTML elements. Does it make sense? So difference
Sir,
between ID and class. ID is unique, class is not.
yes, sir. If you briefly re-explain the HTML element selector, I'm just confused.
This is P, right? This is means we are applying the same CSS to all the P's available inside your page, right?
Okay.
You can use body, right? We have learned about body. This is your HTML element.
Yeah. Okay, got it.
So if you're using HTML element, there is no prefix. If you're using a class, there is a prefix dot. If you're using an ID, there is a prefix hash.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Let's move forward.
Anyone? Any questions? Any doubt? Please feel free to ask. Okay, so we have seen the the internal CSS using a style tag. But what if I want to give the CSS to this particular line? This is not suggestible to do, and this is not a good way of coding, but just to learn. So if I want to give the CSS to this particular paragraph and I don't want to use this particular style tag, I can simply use a attribute called as style. So there is a attribute called as a style. And in this, let's say I will again go for color and let's say brown. Right? So everything remains same. If you see, this is property, this is value, semicolon is there, and style element is there, right? We don't need any selector because we know that we are applying CSS to this line of code. And this is called as inline CSS. Means you are applying to CSS to that particular line. This is called as inline CSS. Right? So you can see the text has changed to brown. Right? So inline CSS is used as an attribute inside the HTML element. Right? So in internal CSS, either you can go for an style tag inside your head, or you can go for inline style tag, which is available as an attribute. This is not suggestible, not recommended at all, not a good practice.
It looks very confusing, right?
Yeah, it's very confusing. Readability is decreased. You cannot identify the CSS at one place. CSS should always be kept at one place. That's the motto.
So it should be internal to that document, for instance, selector.html.
Yes, yes.
Sir, so basically we can divide our old website design in two parts, one formatting and design, and the other is just content.
Yes.
So, yeah. And style, we just covered the style, the colors, the theme, and all the formatting of the view of the view of the contents. But in the body, which is HTML, we just cover the paragraphs, text, and those simple things.
Correct.
Am I true?
Correct. That's correct.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so this is your internal CSS. Let's see an example of how to use an external CSS file. So what you guys can do is you can create your own CSS file, right? CSS file, right? And CSS files are always saved with, let's call it as external CSS, or let's call it as my style, right? CSS files are always saved with the extension called as .css. Make sense?
So you mean one we for now the previous discussion or topic that we had, it was about the CSS inside the HTML, for instance. Yeah. So we had this selector.html that is internal, right? And this
Yes.
is external. For external, we should give a syntax of .css to it.
Yes. First of all, we are creating a CSS file.
Okay.
Right? So this is how we are creating a simple CSS file. We will save it with .css, like we were saving it with .html, right? Let's create and save it. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy this CSS and put it over here. Right? This is not required. All right. So what I've done, I've created a CSS file and I'm putting down my CSS inside that CSS file rather than putting inside a style tag. What we have done, we have created a simple external style sheet using the extension .css where I'm putting my CSS. So CSS is put in the same way it is put inside the selected tag. There is no difference like any difference like that. Now I have to somehow link this my style to this selector element, right? So what I'll do is I'll remove this particular style, right? If I go in my HTML, so this is normal now. I'll remove this particular thing as well, right? This is normal paragraphs. Now I want to apply this my style to this selector.html, right? That's the agenda. So for that, I'm going to use an element called as link, which is used inside your head tag, right? So link. So link here, I'm saying an href tag. It's more like an anchor tag, which we have learned, a tag, right? And then href would be the name of my CSS file. So my style.css, right? What this link represent? This link represent a relationship of style sheet. This my style.css is called as style sheet. So I will simply say style sheet, right? So what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to link my style.css to this selector.html page. So for that, I've used a link tag. Inside that link tag, there is an attribute called as href. Href contains the name of the file. Name of the file is mystyle.css. The relationship, this file represent a style sheet. That's why I'm simply saying a relationship as a style sheet, right? Let me go back to my HTML page and see if it is loaded. Now you can see my CSS is applied to this HTML page, whatever I have written inside my style.css. Anyone, any questions, any doubt?
So what was the benefit of it?
Now you have a separate style file. And that's the most recommended way. Create a separate style file. Now, what's the benefit? I can use this style file anywhere inside my pages, right? So in order to write, I will simply say link link. I'm using the same file in multiple HTML pages, right? So CSS example, I will simply load CSS example as well. Now you can see the CSS would be applied to this. There is no P, there is one P, but P is not working over here because nothing is inside directly inside this P tag. So let's give some random text. And you can see the CSS is applied. Right? So you can use one file in order to change the CSS of multiple HTML pages. This is called as external way of styling an HTML page. And this is the most recommended way to write down your styling.
Cool.
Right? So three ways we have learned. One is external styling. Another one is internal styling. The third one is inline styling. Inline is the least preferred way. External styling is the most preferred way.
So can you select on Selector tab? I just want to see that. Selector HTML. Okay, thank you. Sir, you saved the file mystyle.css in the same folder, right?
Yes, you can keep it in the same folder or you can change the folder. For example, let's create another folder called as CSS, right? All together a new folder. And inside that CSS, I will move my style.css. So first of all, I have to close it from here. Right? So CSS is now moved to over here. But if I'll see, it will not be applied. So Control S. The reason is CSS, it is not able to find the CSS file. So what we have to do is we have to give the exact path. Okay. So either keep it in the same folder or give the whole absolute path.
Okay, thank you, sir.
It works like an anchor tag. Simple. So these are all the properties available inside your CSS, right? So as you can see, they are huge, right? I cannot cover even half of it or 1/4 of it, right? So what I want from you guys is to just have a look on these properties and try a few CSS properties on your own. I'm putting this link inside the chat, right? Once you click on it, they'll give you an example how to use it. But now we have discussed pretty much everything in CSS except for the group selectors. So you can apply any CSS property to your HTML element. So either you can use the HTML selector or you can use the CSS selector, class selector, or you can use the ID selector. You can go for an internal styling. Can go for the external styling. My preferred way is always external styling. It gives me the flexibility to use the same CSS across multiple HTML pages. But if you are sure that your CSS is going to be used inside one single page, always use internal CSS, but never ever use inline CSS. That's the very bad way of writing code because the readability of the code is lost. So one should always, a general tip for all the candidates, one should write the code in such a way that it should be understood by others. For example, let's say I'm in one organization, I'm writing one code. So my code should be understood by Talash or by Furqan for anyone else present, right? They should not need anyone to explain that code, what I have written. That's where your coding standards are made. So we should use always the same standards. That's why I focus more on where we should use capital styling, where we should use camel case, where we should use Pascal. Assignment is go through these CSS selectors which are available, CSS properties. Tomorrow, we are going to talk about group selectors. We are going to talk about margins and paddings. And we are going to talk about position.
Okay, sir.
Right?
Yeah, great. Great. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
again, please go through those HTML properties. I have already sent the link to in
Mhm.
chat. Please copy it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a
Mhm.
good day. Thank you.
Yeah, bye.